Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and there was a time when this shelf here was enough for me to keep all my worm composting systems readily available without needing any other storage space. But you're clearly seeing the evidence that I've kind of outgrown that shelf over here to the right. Little makeshift shelf I created down there on top of buckets, and backing off even further, now you can see I've even, as of my most recent launch of these two newest bins, as well as the cocoon nursery that goes with them over here, is another makeshift table sitting on top of the Vermibag mini frame. One of these days I gotta really think about adding more shelf space. And these systems here too, where sometimes you see a tray resting on top of others, as you see here in a few instances. Usually in my case it means that I've got cocoons going on in the system, and sometimes I also indicate cocoon nursery just by flipping the tag upside down. Either way, sometimes I'm also consuming extra space in my wormery just by hanging on to the old, theoretically harvested castings based on the assumption that the material's got cocoons in it, and that those cocoons, given time, will produce additional worms to add to my worm farm. So one of the systems that I need to check in on is one that's not been checked on in over 2 weeks, 15 days exactly, since we last fed the worms themselves. And at that time we also tried to create a baiting station to try to pull worms that had been left behind within the finished castings. And after about 5 weeks now, I think it's time to see if we can bring a close to that nursery, actually harvest the castings, and relocate whatever worms we've managed to collect there. So I'm going to put on a glove, bring those systems up onto the bench, and we're going to get to work. So earlier I think I mentioned that I had set up this baiting station last time we were in here. It's not true. It was actually already set up and running when we were last in here, except it just didn't really do very well. And we suspected that it was because I was attempting to lure worms out of the finished compost with just bedding only, but that maybe wasn't quite enough to get the worms interested. So we upped the ante and we reloaded this thing using all the existing paper that was already in there, combined with a number of yummy things like cantaloupe rinds, cucumber peels. Offhand I can't remember what else, but I think there may have been even a few other additional things to try to get the worms to actually come on over out of the finished compost into this little contraption so that we can relocate them. And then we can bring it close to this bin finally, give it a good rinse, and recommission it for perhaps a slightly more productive mission than this. Not to say that, attempting to round up babies and just kind of nurture cocoons in finished castings, I don't know, it's not to say that it's a waste of time. It is, fairly time consuming, and usually doesn't yield a huge amount either. So some might consider it as a low value proposition. But usually I'm in no hurry with stuff, and I like kind of experimenting with things anyway. So to me it seems like an activity worth trying. Maybe even just use it as a platform to experiment on and learn from the attempts to see what kind of things to expect from worms. So I'm really thinking we did pull out the last of the worms that had still been in this stuff, because there were only one or two of them. I dropped them here into the plastic tub, and I assume that all the rest of this stuff, as we move away from the baiting box, is just going to be more and more dry. Not that bad. If you go right down to the bottom, there's still a good bit of moisture down here, perhaps giving us just enough reason to make sure we're not leaving any worms potentially in that stuff stranded. But it does seem to me like if there was something like this with veggies all kicking off moisture, veggies and fruits, then the worms would, they zero in on it. So I think we've got ourselves some nice castings here, a lot of things that were still kind of clumpy and kind of holding together, maybe because of a little bit of excess moisture or some sort of a little piece of debris stuck in the middle. I don't know, whatever it is. They're all seeming to break apart pretty easily at this point, and we're getting some really nice, easily flowing stuff here. But I'm really kind of glad to be able to free up this bin for other different purposes. So off comes the label, officially bringing a close to this system after we've kept it around for a little while, after it was officially, depopulated of the primary population. And I don't know, I guess we'll have to see how many babies we rounded up, but we'll do that when we get into the adult bin to feed, and then we'll go ahead and we'll empty my bait station. So let's get that other bin up here and get those guys fed. Alright, so these are the original red wiggler population that I sort of revived from a dwindling number of surviving worms, but I think the population has bounced back quite nicely. And offhand I don't remember, but based on everyone's feedback on how many worms we think we saw when we released them into this system, we also had a chance to observe them when they were being hauled out and collected. But either way, just based on eyewitness accounts and people's comments, we've got a population in here that I believe exceeds 1,000 worms, which is pretty good considering the population started out very, very small. Definitely under 100 worms. So the feeding, I believe, in here was similar to what we had included as the bait. So I think there were cantaloupe bits and maybe cucumber stuff or whatever. And I could see a little bit of a depression here in the middle where we last fed. This bin is pretty young, so we're going to see primarily bedding, I believe. Good amounts of it all over the place. After a couple weeks, though, I'm not sure we're going to see a whole lot of leftovers, considering the types of foods that we gave them. As I recall, they were the types of foods that might get eaten pretty quickly, but I'm already bumping into something here. I can't remember. No, I don't think this was fed during the last check-in, nor during the check-in prior. This might, I don't know, even this could go back to the first feeding. An avocado that was pretty much put in here whole. The worms are definitely starting to take advantage of it, and now I could finally see the pit inside. I don't think it was revealed at all last time we saw that thing. And the worms seem to be enjoying it. But you can imagine it's going to take time for something like that pit or even the shell of that thing to break down. So we're going to find leftovers like that, but just because I find leftovers of materials that I know are going to take a long time doesn't mean I'm going to hold off on applying the next feeding. I know that this thing will be here, for a while, and that the worms will just keep working it. But there's certainly room for more, and I wouldn't use that as a deterrent to tell me that there's no need to feed, because there's always a need to feed, because I've always got stuff that needs to be dispensed with. Alright, so good bits of large chunks of cardboard. A little deviation from what I do usually, which is, use stuff like this. Pretty finely shredded paper and cardboard. But knowing that this thing is still young and got lots and lots of time, it's just as good to just throw large chunks of stuff in there. Might take a little bit longer just because of the surface area not being maximized by being fragmented small. You have to live with the penalty of it taking a little bit longer to break down. Yeah, no signs as far as I could tell of the last feeding. So it's an opportune time to come in here with more. Even though there's good amounts of bedding everywhere in this system, I'm going to be sticking to my routine of always wanting to include lots and lots of bedding in my feedings, at least in the early stages of a bin. Maybe towards the end I'll stick more to just foods and things that I know are all pretty much going to break down quickly, anticipating the harvest of the castings. But here in a place that's only maybe a little bit over a month old, I believe, we got loads and loads of time to see stuff break down. The feeding they're getting today is a little bit what I would consider boring almost. It's coffee I got a little bit of worm chow too. I thought I might sprinkle in there just to make it a little bit more interesting for them. And I guess there's also the release of the contents of this container here. Why don't we drop in the food, get it down below where we're going to be working, drop in the wormies in, and well, I'm assuming we've collected wormies to release. At least I like to think so. So we'll get the leftovers down in here. Drop in a little bit of bedding to go with the food. I mean, yeah, all these filters themselves are also bedding material. I think I'm actually going to hang on to one of them just to show myself where I fed. A little tradition here in my wormery to have a so-called feeding zone indicator. As far as the coffee, I really like to include the coffee as a blend with the bedding I'm putting in. So I'll come in with some of my prepared bedding here. It's pretty damp, but it's loose enough, I believe, to sort of house a good bit of coffee blended in amongst the little bits of paper and cardboard that's all shredded in there. And here too, with plenty of time to go, I don't need to worry about fine shredding the bedding I'm putting in. The stuff can go in pretty large chunk, but you know what? Before we mix in that coffee with the underlying bedding, let's also include a little bit of my worm chow. I don't have a whole lot left in here, but I know I'm going to be making some more in the next day or two, so it wouldn't be the end of the world if we used it all up in here. Try to make a somewhat boring meal of coffee only a little bit more interesting for these little guys. Alright, looking good, looking good. Oops. So before I put in the rest of that coffee, I'm just coming in with yet another handful of my prepared bedding. And we'll just do a repeat of what we did in the previous layer. Looks good. Some of this coffee has been sitting around for a while, so it's got no weight to it. It's very light because it's dry. So when I brought it down here, I thought to myself, ooh, 3 days worth of coffee. But when I lifted it and felt how light it was, I realized that usually I'm just dragging moisture into my bin when I put the used coffee grinds into a worm bin feeding. But in this case, we're definitely not introducing a whole lot of moisture with this feeding. Dry worm chow, almost dry coffee, almost dry bedding. Yeah, a little bit of moisture content to it, but not much. So, let's get this feeding done. Level off the top surface, and then that'll give us a sort of a stage to work on to check out what came together down within our little baiting station. And I won't put the feeding zone indicator down either until we're done here, because I'd like to work just out on the material here. Any worms that we have collected, hopefully there will be some, we'll at this point have direct access to the bedding below, and then only after we've released the wormies that we've collected will I put the feeding zone indicator down. Alright, here we go. Let's get the show on the road. Keeping my fingers crossed here. It was pretty disappointing last time we came in because pretty much no worms came out to see what was going on here. But yeah, you know, if I had to bet, then I would have to think any worms that were in the nursery all came here now, because the castings themselves were pretty much devoid of anything. Still a good bit of leftover bedding in here, it seems. But I'm already seeing like evidence of a worm here. A couple of them actually. Not sure what it is that they're in. Oh, I guess there's a little hole there, so they're actually on the inside here. I see cantaloupe rinds. I guess it's not going to just pop out. I think I crammed it in here a little bit snug, thinking that that might be what the worms like. And look at that. A couple good-sized worms that were just stragglers, didn't really participate in the haul-out activities when we originally migrated the population. But they were there to greet any remaining baby worms that were still lingering within their cocoons, needing to hatch. So I would say, well, I don't know. I'd love to hear people's ideas on what they think they saw here as far as the worm release, how many to add to the current count, and true, I'm probably missing a couple, so take that into consideration when you formulate your estimates, but I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on how many worms we're adding to the system here by rounding up what was still left in the finished castings and allowing time for this nursery to run its course. Here too, some cantaloupe rind leftovers, and worms slithering around, occupying different parts of the material, but obviously not a huge number of worms, otherwise they would have already chewed up the bedding and left behind only castings. So there was even a good amount of leftover bedding here still too. But I'm starting to formulate a number in my head in terms of how many worms we collected here. Certainly not enough to have a dramatic worm release clip to show. Sometimes I would play back worms settling into their new home back in fast motion on video, but I think here we're just kind of going to focus on making sure we don't leave any of them behind within this vessel. So maybe I'll try to save time on the video by doing a final rescue of wormies out of this stuff off camera, and that will just permit us to bring this session to a close. So, following tradition, this coffee filter's meaning is that was where we fed most recently. Oops, and I think we just lost another glove. I usually make an effort to make my gloves last, and I reuse them over and over and over again until they become unusable, like this one appears to have. So, on goes this covering. My new systems, I think, benefit from having a plastic covering. I wouldn't want the system to lose its moisture content too quickly. And, yeah, the other thing we could do is even give them more bedding to nibble on. When there's a big piece of paper like this right underneath the plastic covering, it becomes sort of a moisture haven where all that moisture that would otherwise evaporate away gets caught underneath, creates a little bit of a steam room for them to hang out in. And you know how worms love their moisture. So we're almost done here. I got a few things I got to clean up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. Before I go though, let me real quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.